Okay, the third pain of imprisonment is the deprivation of heterosexual relationships. And this is a two-part deprivation. The first part involves the lack of opportunity for sexual relationships while incarcerated. And I'll note again that this book was written in the 1950s. And while we're talking about the lack of sexual intercourse or relationships, the standard for this book is the heterosexual relationship. The lack of consequence of this deprivation on inmates who identify as homosexual is mentioned in passing, but the author is going to treat it as a form of deviant behavior that's not a concern for his study. So while we're focusing on heterosexual relationships, we'll keep in the back of our mind that not all inmates identify as heterosexual, and we need more information on and more studies on how this deprivation affects different inmates that don't necessarily fit in this target audience. But for the heterosexual inmate, while the lack of sexual intercourse or the opportunity for sexual intercourse is a source of frustration and one that's valid, it's not the most significant source of pain within this deprivation. The more interesting part comes from the lack of heterosexual relationships, or in other words, just normal interactions that you have with members of the opposite sex. So the lack of these interactions presents a serious threat to the inmate's self-image. The inmate, like all of us, must find his identity within himself, and we find our identities as an image reflected in the eyes of those people around us who we interact with on a daily basis. Being shut off from a quote unquote world of women leaves him devoid of half of his completed self image, and he's left with only the portion of his personality that is recognized by men. So when we talk about this self image, we can relate it to the sociological theory of the looking glass self. Who we see ourselves as is basically an image reflected by others. So if you are only getting input from half of the population, half of your self-image is kind of absent or missing. So this this flux of who you are as an individual is kind of changing or left void from your normal experience, and it's kind of a challenging of one's manhood when who you are as an individual is not always reflected by the population in which you are living. So that lack of interaction with it's important to note that we're talking about normal interactions. There are um, women in men's prisons. There are inmates that are all men, but there are civilian staff. There are female correctional officers, but those don't present normal interactions. Those are authority figures and subordinates. They are wary of the status of the inmate. Inmates aren't having normal interactions with members of the opposite sex. The only on level relationships that they have are with members of the same sex, and that's where this deprivation starts.